Hey everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My guest today, a returning guest, Jessica Hooten Wilson, who was previously on to talk about Walker Percy's novel Love in the Ruins. She is the Fletcher Jones Endowed Chair of Great Books at Pepperdine University. She's the author of a number of books on literature, including books on Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, making her That Unusual Thing, an Anglican expert on mid-century Catholic fiction, and Dostoevsky as well. And I'm having her on today because she has written a new book that gives us a look at Flannery O'Connor's unfinished third novel. The book is titled Flannery O'Connor's Why Do the Heathen Rage? A behind-the-scenes look at a work in progress. Welcome back, Jessica.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again.
So how did this book, and by this book I mean your book, come to be? And what brought you into contact with the scraps and fragments of this unfinished O'Connor novel?
Yeah, so in my version of Why Did the Heathen Rage, I give an opening story that kind of tells how I came in contact with the manuscript. So here's like a brief overview of it. But essentially, I was working on Flannery O'Connor since I was 15 years old. I just fell in love with her and ended up doing my dissertation on her under Ralph Wood at Baylor. And after that was finished, I did the International Flannery O'Connor Conference. And that's when I first heard about Flannery's unfinished novel from Billy Sessions. And later, when I went to the archives and kind of went through them, I did my own interpretation of what I thought she might have been up to at the end. And when I did that, Louise Florencourt and Billy heard my paper. I gave the paper at Chicago, like, here's what I think Flannery was doing in the unfinished novel. And they loved it. They were on board with my vision for it and how well I had presented the material. And so Billy kind of followed up with me. He's like, I don't think I'm going to get around to finishing the novel. I think you should. And so I went back and forth with the estate and became kind of the authorized person originally to kind of bring it to fruition. And after a lot of work on the different drafts, there was just a lot of divided opinion about how to get it out. And so I'm glad that after 10 years, we finally have something to show the public and kind of see, okay, this is what Flannery was up to, and this is what she was working on, and this is what we can learn from her unfinished work. So that's kind of the short version of my really long story for the last 10, 15 years.
So when Christopher Tolkien edited together different versions of the Silmarillion, which his father had been working on his whole life and never finished before dying, he edited it together into sort of a complete work. But my understanding is we just didn't have enough of this book. She didn't get far enough along for that to be able to be possible. You called this your version of Why Do the Heathen Rage? So what did you mean by that, and what should a reader come to this book expecting and not expecting?
Yeah, sure. It would have been amazing if she would have left us behind like an outline, a, full story. She left behind 378 pages of disconnected episodes. And a lot of the material, so if you look at her previous two novels and how she went about writing those novels, she was regularly like working on creating these story moments and trying to figure out the characters. And sometimes, like if you look at the Violent Buried Away manuscripts, the characters she start with don't even end up in the final versions, right? So she's just always kind of playing with different things in the beginning, and it takes her a long time to write novels. And then some of it gets ciphered off into different stories. So my version of the material, what I did is I tried to put together as many of the episodes as I possibly could and come up with the best possible version from what she left behind, so where she edited and so forth. And then from those scenes, I filled in the gaps in between with the kind of the story historically and biographically of Flannery. So trying to like kind of pull back the curtain and say, okay, let's look at her working on this. What time period are we in? Where is she in her career? Where is she in her thought process? What is she reading? What is she seeing on the news? And kind of do a literary excavation of behind the scenes of the fragments that we have so I could tell like a full story. So that essentially like you're not getting her finished novel, but you're getting a story of how she was going about writing this novel, and then how we as readers can kind of pick up from where she left us.
Yeah. And there's also a fair bit of there's that imaginative reconstruction, of course, that you mentioned, but also a fair bit of what you might call critical commentary the work as it was emerging in connection with her previous work and her letters and, different issues that people have brought up, especially in recent years, the racial stuff that sort of got sparked off, I guess, again, when Paul Elie wrote that, New Yorker essay that annoyed everybody so much. Just to want people to have a sort of a sense of what to expect going into it, not to expect like a complete seamless, story from Flannery. So what do we know about the circumstances under which she was working on this novel?
Yeah, so anyone who's familiar with Flannery O'Connor knows she's really a great short story writer. And by the time she had died, she had written 2 novels, both of which she said just took her, the first one took 5 years, second one took 7 years. And so when she's working on this one, she's also working on her second collection of short stories. So she's kind of doing both projects simultaneously, which means she's just very much at the beginning of her process. I think she's writing somewhere between 1962 and 1964. So I don't think she worked more than 2 years on the project, probably about 18 months approximately.
Okay.
Some people think she was working as early as 1960. Just based on a lot of the things in her letters and her biography, I just don't think so, but who knows? There's all sorts of ways I could be wrong, and I don't think that there's any way for us to prove unless we start carbon dating some of that paper. But during this time of her life, she says multiple times in different letters to her editor, to Sister Mariella Gable, to friends like Cecil Dawkins, I just don't think I can do the same thing I've done in these previous works. But I don't think that I can do what I've done previously. Instead, I have to try something different. And by that, she said, she even calls it the larger things in the letter to Sister Mariella. She says, these larger things, I don't even know if I'm capable of doing, but by the larger things, it seems like what she was pointing to were different tactics aesthetically, but also trying to see some of her contemporary moment in light of the eternal things that she'd always written about. So, for example, in 1975, Alice Walker writes this phenomenal essay about Flannery O'Connor where she goes and visits Andalusia. And Alice Walker just talks about how much she loved Flannery, but then she hated Flannery because Flannery was a white woman. But at the same time, she loved Flannery's fiction, and she just couldn't, she went back and forth. And she said, ultimately, where Flannery's shortcomings were when it came to understanding race and the relationship between Black and white writers, she was ultimately writing about revelation more than she was writing about race. And so when she's writing about prophets, when she's writing about freaks, when she's writing about these revelation issues, she's just really good, and you just can't turn away from her, and you're just attracted and in love with the vision that she shows you. And that's what Walker ultimately ends with. And I think that when we're looking at Flannery in these last years, she's trying to understand something that's contemporary, which is the start of the civil rights movement, in light of the things that the gospel shows us that are eternal realities about the equality that's in each person because of the Imago Dei, the ways that we should live together, the ways that we should be in friendship with one another. And these are things that I think she's trying to reflect on, and she's not really seeing a model for in her segregated Southern world. And those are, I think, were the larger things she was trying to get at.
Yeah, that's interesting. And just the idea that she was trying to break out of a certain mold aesthetically as well is very interesting to me. I think the first time I really talked about Flannery O'Connor on this podcast was maybe my first interview with Joshua Wren, and we talked about some of her limitations aesthetically as well. When you read, and I think you mentioned this in the book as well, that when you read all of her short stories, you start to see like repeating motifs, which of course every author has, but sometimes it's like, oh well, this character's Flannery and this character's Flannery. It kind of feels like that sometimes. There's like the sort of disaffected young intellectual with the Philistine parent or older relative that they live with, usually often a woman, and also the kind of like the famously like violent moments of revelation or grace, and often her stories ending with a death. And she actually said that she wanted to try to learn to write a moment of grace that didn't require somebody to die or have some, be horribly mangled or something. So yeah, can you talk about that a little bit? Because that's very interesting to me.
Yeah. So After she passed, there were a lot of people that were going back and forth on whether this became formulaic. And there were some critics that were just saying it's just so formulaic. And there were other critics that were like, she had one story to tell and she told it so well, right? And so there's different ways to see the very same facts, is that Flannery takes a lot of very similar kind of characters, these intellectuals living at home that are just really not enjoying living at home, and they're having a dominating mother, and then there's a violent epiphany. Well, in this story, what she does is she's actually trying to set up the epiphany not as the end, not as the climactic moment, are they going to accept grace or not as it comes to them in this violent intrusion, but rather in the beginning, and it's going to be this gradual coming to faith.
Yeah.
It always makes me think of C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy, because I've just taught that for so many years, and maybe even Augustine would be a great example too, is both of them kind of intellectually assent to the faith, and then they have to move their wills, and they each have different ways of like moving their wills, but there's no violent intrusion in Confessions. There's no violent intrusion in C.S. Lewis's work. And instead they just, yes, this is what I will believe. Now what, right? And I think Flannery's trying to write that next picture of now what after you ascend to the faith. And so Walter Tillman, her protagonist, is going to do that. And she then has to write out his journey of living according to what he now believes, right? And how does that matter? And how does that affect how he lives? And she had not done that before.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, and that's something I've talked about as well before. Is more generally is this idea of a lot of stories about religious fiction. They take you to the point of an epiphany, or they take you to the point of a conversion, but they don't show. They're not necessarily as good, or they don't even necessarily attempt to show the ongoing life of growing in holiness. One film that's a notable exception to that is this French movie from, I think, the early 40s, Monsieur Vincent, which is about Saint Vincent de Paul, and it starts. He's already a holy man when it starts, and it actually shows you his continued growth from a place of great virtue and holiness, and his continued challenges, and the ways that he goes deeper, and the way that he's his trials and things like that. But that's a pretty exceptional, at least in film, for example, that's a pretty exceptional case of somebody being able to do that. And sometimes I wonder if that's because, so many of us religious people have the experience of having, an epiphany or things like that, but perhaps we feel less successful in, living that out and carrying that forward all the time, and really growing and having sort of stability in that. So to me, I always want to see more of that in fiction, because I don't know which is more aesthetically challenging, but I do know which is more more people are able from their own experience to write about the path leading up to the epiphany than to write about what comes after that, compellingly. Yeah. So, it's really, it's cool to me that she was trying to work on that. And I did find myself wishing that I could have seen this completed novel as I was reading it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think of Diary of a Country Priest, right? We as readers are watching someone who looks like a failure, and actually he's just a success as a saint. He's a worldly failure who's a success as a saint. Right. I think there were some models. She read a ton of Mauriac. She read a lot of Bernanos and Green and so forth. And so she had some of those precursors, but they just looked nothing like what she had been writing before. And she confesses to one friend, like, I want to try to approach God's voice the way that Elias heard it in the cave. Right? That's the new motif that she wanted to work with. That's the new way that she wanted to hear God's voice. And that's just not the same dramatic copy that she'd had before, right? Like, she'd always had the lightning strike. It was more like Paul on the road to Damascus. Like that, those were the kinds of stories that she told. And now she's like, I have to approach God differently.
Right. Well, it's the same. It's the famous quote, from her about, for the blind, you have to draw, large startling figures. For the deaf, you have to shout. And so that, as you well know, has been part of the basis for an ongoing discussion about Catholic fiction, going back to, again, Paul Elie and Dana Gioia having an exchange about, the state of Catholic fiction today and what it should look like and all of that. But Yeah, maybe I should say Gregory Wolfe. Yeah, he's also one of the big figures in
Yeah.
that discussion as well.
And Randy Boyagoda,
Um,
and that
a
was
while.
2014 or
Yeah,
so.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Just when I was starting to sort of pay attention to this world, I
Yeah.
remember. Now, before I go on, just a quick word, if I may, about Catholic Culture's May fundraising campaign. We're calling it the Queen of Peace campaign. There's a lot of need for peace in the church, not just in the sort of geopolitical sphere, but in the church, in our own souls. So that's why we chose to emphasize that theme when Catholic media and especially social media tends to rob us of our peace. Catholic Culture is the producer of the Catholic Culture podcast. It's a nonprofit Catholic apostolate. If you find yourself benefiting from the Catholic Culture podcast or any of our podcasts, our YouTube channel, audiobooks, all the stuff on our website, our news, our commentary, our liturgical year resources, our library, any of that stuff, please do consider donating to help us continue into the remainder of 2024. We're trying to meet a $50,000 donation goal for this period of May. If you want to help out, we do really appreciate it. Go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio so we will know that you are a podcast listener sending in your donation. And we pray for our benefactors daily. I pray for all of my listeners daily, but of course for the benefactors, for the donors. God bless you, and on with the show. Yeah, what's the novel about? I'm sure people want to hear that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, sure. So you should say, like, what's the premise of the novel?
Right.
Right?
Yeah, fair enough.
It doesn't actually get into it. So the premise of the novel is that you have Walter Tillman. So he does seem like an Asbury Fox, if you're familiar with The Enduring Chill, or he seems like a Julian from Everything Rises Must Converge, or Thomas from Comforts of Home. He is this dissatisfied, disgruntled, intellectual, white Southern male living back at home. So he's gone off and gotten educated and then done nothing with it, right? And he comes home to live on the farm with his parents. In this case, we actually do have a father figure, though he's not much more effective in the story than the missing father figures in most of her other work because he's had a stroke. So he's still, Flannery herself lost her father. So a lot of times she just doesn't know how to write these father figures in these stories. And so he has a stroke. And then the mother is this domineering woman, just a very typical kind of setup. But here's where it changes. Walter Tillman is a correspondent with multiple people. So what he loves doing is he will write letters to people. Like he'll write a Methodist pastor and just have all these faith questions. And he puts on this persona that he thinks the Methodist pastor would want to read about. Then when he gets bored, he just writes deceased, returned to sender on the envelope and stops the correspondence. He does this with another woman who writes like crazy poetry. And when he starts writing someone named Una Gibbs in New York, she's a civil rights correspondent who's broken through the ceiling of religion. It's funny because a lot of the things that she says, Mariette Lee, which is one of Flannery's correspondents, was also saying to Flannery. So there's this kind of mocking of this person, but we also know that Flannery loved Mariette. So there's this sense of loving and mocking that happens between Walter and Una in their letter writing back and forth, where they seem to be actually learning from one another. And Walter tries to challenge what he's learning from her. He's like, oh, you've broken through the ceiling of religion. You believe that all people are equal. You love all people. I don't believe that's true. If you actually came and saw me in person and touched my face, you'd be horrified because I'm black. And so he's putting on this epistolary blackface. Yeah. And he's not. He's a white intellectual sitting at home pretending to be black through the mail to Una Gibbs. And of course she says, well, then I'm coming. I'm going to prove to you that I love you. And so that's how the whole novel gets set up. Unfortunately, we don't get to see them meet. There's a dream sequence briefly where they meet. We don't get to see how she would have enjoyed the farm or not liked the farm. I ghost wrote the novel. I did several versions of this book, and I ghost wrote the novel at one point. And so I got to like show their meeting and like imagine all these things from their meeting that I just think would be a great story. I think Flannery would have been onto something, and I think she could have pulled this off if the Lord had granted her another 10 years. But we just see Una coming that direction. That's all we see. And we see Walter just scared to death. Like, what is it going to look like for us to actually meet in person? And that's kind of the starting point of the story, right? It's him trying to come to that realization of how to treat her and why does she matter and why does his feelings about her matter if he has always been kind of this atheist where people don't matter.
And, a lot of the people he writes to when he puts on a persona, it's somebody that he kind of has contempt for. So what is it that he finds so offensive about Una initially?
Yeah. Yeah. He hates, well, so when he's writing her, I mean, she does come off kind of silly, right? She says a bunch of like spiritual new age kind of things. He counts up the exclamation points in her letters. He's like 11 exclamation points. He's like, hysteria ruins syntax.
Right.
I loved a lot of those comments. But then as he's reading, he says, good God in hell. She set herself up in the place of God. He uses the word abrogate. She abrogated the place of God, right? Lightning does not originate in the person. There must be a source for this lightning to have struck her. And when he starts saying these things out loud where he wants to refute her errors, he realizes the only basis by which he can refute her is if theology is true and God is real.
Yeah.
And that kind of interaction with her letters, it's in trying to mock her that he ends up converting himself or being converted.
Yeah. Any chance you could read a passage for us, maybe from somewhere in that chapter where he starts writing to Una?
So this will be from her first. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And then
that's fine.
Okay. This is kind of what I just quoted because this is the part that
I think
when I read this, I wanted to just.
So you're reading.
I wanted to publish.
You're starting with part of her letter to him.
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, so this is where she's started this whole organization called Friendship Incorporated. And she says things like, we can't use the word love because people take it the wrong way. Charity won't do because it sounds religious and we aren't. There's none of that kind of nonsense about this. It's all in us, in you and me. It's something we've got. The prize is right now. The salvation is right now. There's no eternal reward, no postponement. You rot when you die, and you only live once, and then you only live when you love. Enough for now. And then, of course, Walter pulled his handkerchief from his back pocket and blew his nose vigorously. A huge shudder, that's one of Flannery's favorite words, a huge shudder passed over him, which ended with small, insidious, sensual tremor. He put the handkerchief back and returned the letter gingerly to the envelope. Then he sat holding it by the far corner as if it were something contaminated, which he must nevertheless preserve. Good God in hell, Walter murmured. His repulsion was deep and central. He felt a certain pull toward the letter and withdrew it again from the envelope. Skipping the words, he counted the exclamation points. 17. His injured eye fell on the word enough. What enraged him was not this, but something basic. Something that offended the order of the universe. She admitted being someone whom lightning had struck. Lightning does not originate in the person. I love that.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. And he's somebody who's been reading like the church fathers and the history of the ecclesial history and stuff and not really believing in any of it. And then suddenly he realizes, oh, I actually believe this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A good parallel. I mean, for people who think this is like nonsensical, like, I think Flannery writes about stuff that's very realistic and people they constantly see the freak, and Flannery was always correcting them because for her, the freak was just realistic. We were just able to see what's actually there. And I think of Bart Ehrman, who's in North Carolina, who teaches on the New Testament and just despises the New Testament. He teaches on the church history and teaches people how to read it, but he despises all of it. He thinks all of it's nonsensical and none of it's true. So this idea, when people were first reading this manuscript and responding to me, they're like, well, that's ridiculous. Why would you read all of this church history and read all of this saints' lives and things like that if you hated it so much? I'm like, there's people all over the academy who do that on a regular basis. Yeah. So I think that Flannery's good at getting at what's real and what's out there that we're not even looking at.
Yeah, it's always weird to me when you see, somebody who works in like medieval studies and then would like try to cancel anybody who had the views of the people that they're studying all the time, or you see that in Tolkien, some Tolkien fans as well. But yeah, no, it is interesting to see that, another bit is where Walter's mother discovers one of his books in his room and he's reading St. Jerome. And it's this passage about from a letter, St. Jerome's letter to Heliodorus, where he's trying to get him to come back to the monastic life, I think. And he's talking about, he's using this imagery of Christ, in this sort of militant mode. And this is very recognizable if you've read other stories by Flannery O'Connor, is, the modern person the modern pragmatic, Southerner who finds any real sort of like weight or strength or militancy or any of that to Christianity to be kind of grotesque. And she says, she talks about how this generation, they like ugly pictures, they like ugly music, and they like an ugly Jesus, because the idea of Jesus, coming with a sword, is just is ugly to her. And that was a bit where I was like, oh yeah, I can think of passages like this in previous Flannery works that I've read.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and Flannery, she was reviewing all these theology books on the side just for fun, kind of giving herself her own education in theology. And at one point she realizes, maybe I'm actually writing medieval morality plays. She writes this in a letter. And it just suddenly occurs to her, like, I think this is maybe what I'm doing, is I'm taking this kind of old mode and applying it to the South and seeing the religious ramification for what's here. The rest of the modern world, as she would put it, says that faith is an electric blanket. And what she's doing is she's showing what the medievals always showed, was the grotesque Jesus on the cross being crucified, right? And that kind of stark image, that gory realism that she was able to pull, was very offensive to people.
At the end of the chapter where Walter is writing with Una, and it's really fun because, the first letter she writes, and the way Flannery replicates a certain style of writing, which is so sappy and kind of juvenile. And then he responds to her and says, well, I'm black and I don't think you'd want to come see me. And then you get these unexpectedly, acerbic answer from her where she challenges him, and she says, oh, you're just wallowing in self-pity. And she's not, because, well, if you think about a modern day person who received that challenge, right, they would be afraid to come back at the person like that. They'd be like, well, I don't want to seem like I'm criticizing you because you're black. So I can't say, so I can't say anything. And she says, I don't care that you're black. I'm just criticizing your character,
Yes.
And she comes, so it's like, I think he doesn't expect it, and the reader does not expect her to come back with like a real challenge for him. So that's a fun moment where the shoe is sort of on the other foot. But after that, Walter says of himself, as far as Negroes went, his fictional sense was inadequate. He could only look at them from the outside. And is this something that Flannery had a kind of a self-awareness about, as evidenced in her letters?
Yeah, she was in a 1959 interview. She says something very similar to what Walter says here, right? She says, and she mentions Georgia is segregated. It is a segregated world where I do not have access to understand how Black people think. And I know that sounds crazy. I read this, one of my friends is a pastor of a First African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so when I was reading through these drafts with him and asking what he thought about this, he's like, well, but she's not assuming there's enough humanity that we would understand each other's perspective. Shouldn't she just start from the premise that we're all human beings and write Black people like human beings? But the difficulty is that the human beings that she had access to were being forced in the segregated South to play a certain kind of role. Right? As Hilton Owls mentions, they perform this Amos and Andy routine. They are performing for her. So she's not able to have a real relationship because of the system that she's in. It's kind of like, if you ever see like a very patriarchal system in which women are not supposed to talk or have voices, you can't imagine that they have thoughts because they haven't been allowed to talk, right? They haven't been allowed to voice. It's that same kind of, the system has changed her access. And so she isn't able to get into their mindset. And so in a lot of ways, she was not just protecting herself, she was protecting African Americans. She assumed the dignity that they had other things going on and that they were playing a role with her.
Right.
She didn't assume that they were the caricature they were being forced to play in that world.
Yeah, because right after that, Walter says, he says he's talking about a specific type of Black person, namely, the people he's familiar with, the servants, Roosevelt, his father's, assistant, and things like that, and that they're sort of impenetrable to him. And whereas he thinks, well, a young, educated Black man, I should be able to, get into his headspace and be able to impersonate him better. So the way you explain that makes sense, even just based on what she writes from Walter's perspective in this passage.
Yeah, I think she has this kind of history that we've kind of pushed to the side when it comes to her biography, but she went to Iowa, to New York,
Right.
to Connecticut,
Right.
right? She had these
Yeah.
experiences before she was in exile in the South, where she was living an integrated life. And so she was able to kind of come back to her own world as both a perspective of an insider and an outsider. And I think that really affects the way that she writes fiction. That's why she's able to be so critical sometimes of the Southern world she lived in.
We see that a bit in a couple of passages in these drafts where Walter is remembering I think just for like a paragraph, he's remembering his life was it in New York that he had been, or some city?
Well, it says North.
Yeah, he was in the North,
so
and he was trying to be an artist and, living this sort of bohemian life. And so there's that. And then there's, of course, the description of Una Gibbs and her mother in their, basically, essentially like West Harlem apartment.
Yeah.
I think it said 110th in Riverside, something like that.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. And too, also it seemed like that character, did you have the impression that Una Gibbs is kind of a different character than the one that we first encounter through the letters?
Yeah, I think so. Flannery goes back and forth with this character. I don't think she was ever satisfied with her. At several points, she's named Sarah, which of course becomes the character in Comforts of Home.
Okay.
The relationship between that Sarah, kind of that prostitute-ish, challenging boundaries person, and also this character she's working on where she thought maybe Walter's aunt was the person who was living, and then this was his cousin, this daughter that she has, and so all the personalities kind of conflate in a sense. If we look back at Flannery and how she has these certain types of characters and then plugs them into the plot, that's kind of what's happening with this Una character, is that they just become the kind of the grit in the shoe. This character is going to fill that role, but who exactly this person is, Flannery didn't have down yet.
Right. I mean, it was interesting, that chapter with her and her mother, because we get this whole other drama, like on a whole different topic, where this flashback to her mother, who was this, I guess a single mom and raised her in this kind of very bohemian activist, kind of free thinking way. And now her mother's very ill and dying. And, Una feels this pressure to sort of prove herself by euthanizing her mother, basically, because she thinks that that's what her mother would have wanted if she was strong. And so, I mean, that's very interesting too. I mean, I just read this really good novel by Daniel McInerney called what's the name of it? The Good Death of Kate Montclair. It's actually a nice little novel, and it's on that topic of euthanasia as well, set in the present day. I think you'd enjoy it, actually. But he's Ralph McInerney's son. I don't know if you...
Yes. Yeah, I do.
Anyway, so we had a chance to talk about that theme a lot, but yeah, it's interesting in how she's sort of, there's that conflict over that and whether she's going to be able to go through it. And I mean, that's a whole other thing we could talk about, obviously, but it's interesting. It seems like almost feels like part of a different book, even though it's set as a kind of a flashback.
Yeah, it's interesting because, Pope John Paul II, of course, is not around during Flannery's lifetime, but shortly following his idea of like culture of life, culture of death, Flannery just feels like she's prophetically seeing this when she starts. And she, of course, is being influenced by, I can't remember their names. Lael, I write about it in the book, but they had just written a story, this husband and wife, about committing murder and suicide because he was dying. And so Flannery is able to see that, again, the things that are around her and take this fictional perspective where she's tying it into people breaking through the ceiling of religion, people throwing off these ties to the here and now. The body just rots and dies. Well, when you take that kind of empirical look at a human being to the nth degree, then you can justify murder and euthanasia. And so Flannery is tying that character who writes the letters, Una Gibbs, with this other character who's willing to commit the murder of her mother and suicide herself. And she's showing the culture of death, right? And that hadn't even been talked about yet. So we can see kind of the troubling things in our own culture that Flannery wants us to be able to see, that kind of prophecy. Where does these things go to? What kind of vision should we have on these contemporary issues?
We've talked about the themes that she dealt with a lot. Is there anything that you learned about her writing process on a more kind of craft level from studying these bits and pieces?
Yeah, this has been such a long journey. So I do wonder at what point I started seeing certain things that I now use in my teaching and now I understand from within, because I was having to look at just her word choices so closely. I was having to look at her syntax all the time. When does she write long sentences? You just read Violent Bear It Away. The opening paragraph is one sentence. Whereas a lot of Flannery's writing sometimes is the short, almost Hebraic, like biblical short sentences, subject, action, verb. So when is she doing these different things and why is she doing them? And trying to understand her as a writer from the inside and spending the last 10 years doing that. Like, I can read her short stories in a way that I just don't ever remember being able to do before. And I can't remember if that is something I had access to before. But having to really look, would she ever use this word? Would she use a color this way? Would she use numbers this way, right? She's just very conscious about all of those little details. And I don't think that most people read Flannery that closely, but I always feel like that's the key to reading Flannery, is every single word mattered to her. And as I went through her process, the number of times that she would strike out girl and replace it with woman, or strike out woman and replace it with girl. I mean, she was so closely reading her own work. And a lot of times we talk about Flannery, we know that she got up every morning and just wrote for 3 hours. And even at the end of her life, I mean, if you look at her letters in July, she just took the extreme unction, right? She just took the last rites and she still gets up for 2 hours. She has barely the strength to do anything and she's going to die in a few weeks. And she gets up and at least does 2 hours. I mean, so she's just very dedicated to her craft. Even if she doesn't have new thoughts, she would rewrite the same page over and over and over again. And can you imagine? I mean, none of us are required to do that now. Like, if I was required to write a novel by rewriting the same page over and over again until a new thought struck me, how well that one page would be. Right? And so if we think about the way that she was doing her craft when it comes to even that kind of technology, the requirement of the typewriter to rewrite the page the way she was doing it, shows us just how attentive she was to the small things. It shows us more of the craftswoman behind it than to kind of throw off and say she had these forms and these formulas and she filled them out and she just put together these works. Like, no, she was a craftswoman. She was very attentive.
Great. Well, anything else we should touch on before we wrap up?
I think that, I hope a lot of people see that I had it illustrated. I think that that's key to reading the book well. And one of the things I'm hoping to do with the book is to say, okay, we have all these leftover pieces, but the whole point of it is the reader's conversation with these leftover pieces. Flannery just didn't want things to sit in the archives. I mean, the reason I'm publishing this has little to do with me and everything to do with Flannery. When you look back at her writing and the way that she thought about her writing, she wanted it to start conversations. She wanted people to be talking about these things. And she just would always leave those things in God's hands. She would say, you write a book and then you just give it to God. And you don't read the reviews of your own work. You just let people have these conversations and let these things happen. And I hired Steve Prince because he's an amazing artist who I thought would be able to capture a different kind of conversational angle on Flannery's work. So what I'm hoping the book does is becomes this conversation starter between Flannery's work, between my literary unpacking, my literary criticism, and also between Steve's art, right? That people would be able to open this up and say, okay, what is going on in our own culture that we should be able to see the eternal things in? How does Flannery give us a model for that? How do we look into these contemporary issues that are now in the 21st century and are maybe different or the same as what we've inherited from the 20th century? And how do we look at these things? So I think that the artwork hopefully does that, and that more people should be looking at that more closely. If people bought the book only for the art, I'd be happy. Nice.
All right. Well, congratulations on, getting the gig of handling this material. And I enjoyed reading it. So thanks for coming back on the show.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope more people are reading Flannery because of it.
Yeah, so for the listener, again, the book is Flannery O'Connor's Why Do the Heathen Rage? A behind-the-scenes look at a work in progress by Jessica Hooten Wilson. And that's it for now. I'll see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.